hello, everyone. I am so excited for our conversation today with Miss Sharissa Deppen. We are going to dig into the idea of introverted leadership. Now, or let me rephrase it a different way, leaders who happen to be introverts versus me, extrovert. And what does that mean? How does it show up? How do we think about it when we are in a leadership capacity and in the workplace? So this is going to be super fun because this is complete 180 from what I usually am. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. So Sharissa, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's an absolute pleasure. I can't wait to get into our discussion, Kimberly. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. So I'll give you a moment. Introduce yourself to to our listeners and tell us a little bit more about you and the work that you do.
Absolutely. Well, I'm Sharissa Deppen. And so the work that I do is primarily focused on helping and supporting introverted servant leaders. And so what I mean by that, and we'll go a lot into detail, I'm sure, today about what that means as far as the introverted side goes. But I also combine that with servant leadership because the people that I tend to coach and attract into my coaching practice are very people focused. So they want to help, they want to support others, and they want to know how to do it based on their personality, their natural tendencies, their strengths, all of those kinds of things. And so that's why I combine the introverted servant leader, and I serve and support leaders who identify with being an introverted servant leader. So I'm so excited to be here. And also the company that I have and that I'm a part of is Leadership Mastery Alliance. And so all of the work that we do is under Leadership Mastery Alliance. Thank you again for having me.
Well, I'm so excited. So let's start with the most obvious question. Why is this a passion of yours? Like working with this specific kind of personality? What drives you in that direction?
I guess the easy answer to that is me. There's so much in that I identify with. And it also came from a place of real struggle that I went through myself in that corporate space, being an introverted leader and trying to figure out, okay, how do I navigate, in this space? And I was comparing myself to other people, to be honest with you. And there was a lot of things that just weren't quite aligning with me and what I'm passionate about, and just a lot of things that just weren't working well. It was only through that process of self-discovery, finding a coach, doing all of that work, that I was like, oh my goodness, wait, there's nothing wrong with me. There's actually a couple of things that I needed to just really understand about myself and my strengths that gives me a different perspective and helps me show up in a way that's a lot more confident and secure in who I am and the way that God made me. So that's basically where that came from. But also in my years of coaching, so I've been doing this for, gosh, it's crazy now, over a decade.
Yeah.
I've coached well over 1,000 leaders at this point. And so in doing that, the other thing that I noticed is that I'm not alone. And that wasn't unique to me, but there are a lot of introverted leaders who, even though they might be, outwardly very confident, and of course they, very accomplished people and leaders, but at the same time, the questions that I started to get was, okay, I'm an introvert. I don't naturally function in a way that I'm asked to function in a workplace setting. So how do I navigate this? How do I play to my strengths and still get the level of impact and influence that I have, but still honoring who I am and the way I'm wired and my personality and things like that? And so that's really where this came from. And so I just absolutely love the work that I do. And you can tell I'm super passionate.
I absolutely can tell. So a couple things were naturally came to mind. So when I was preparing for our conversation, I was thinking back just in general of different leaders that I've worked with, just myself, and and thinking through like, what are the challenges that people who are naturally more introverted must face? And my first thought is as a natural extrovert, as somebody who just naturally, I have no problem. You can stick me in any room with anybody and I can walk out with, like, if there's 20 people in there, I'll probably walk out with 20 friends. Like,
Awesome.
but I can also see where, as someone who is not naturally that way, that it would make it much harder for them, to even get into a leadership position, right? Because to get anywhere in your career, you have to self-advocate. So if that's naturally not a position that you're comfortable in, that it must be hard to get into that position. And then also, if you get in that position, then must be difficult to continue to move forward in like a promotional path. So I would love to hear from your perspective. Those were just the first two obvious challenges, I thought, but I wanted to know from you, are those valid? And then what other challenges might people be facing that
Such a good question.
might not be obvious to others?
Yeah. And I love that you went right there, because that is like commonly what a lot of people come into the very first session with me. They're like, okay, here's the thing, like this is what I want to achieve, but I'm not naturally good at some of the things that I feel I need to be good at in order to progress in my career, or whatever the case may be. And so there's a couple of things. First of all, I want to go back to like the difference between introversion and extroversion, because I think it's going to help answer that question as well. So there's a lot of different ways to interpret that, or to define what an introvert versus an extrovert is. But one of the definitions that I really love is this idea of where you get your energy. So introverts tend to get their energy by, being away from people. Like they're very introspective. They take in, they're constantly absorbing from their environments and what's going on around them. And so they need that time to kind of, be by themselves, process and recharge, so that when they do, engage with others in conversation, or in, a group setting or whatever it is, they feel like they're ready and prepared and they can do that. So they're definitely not antisocial. And I only say that because I labeled myself as antisocial, from the time I was a child, because everyone was like, why are you so quiet? Why are you not, like interacting and doing all these different things? And so I basically told myself the story that there's something wrong with me, because I don't show up in a certain way. But that's not necessarily the case. Introverts are not
I think that happens though, right? And I don't think it's just you. I think when you see people who are naturally quieter, negative assumptions get made as to why they're not engaging like everyone else. So I don't think that's just you. I think that, and that's why I think this conversation is so important and valid, is just because they're not as vocal doesn't mean there's anything wrong.
Absolutely. And I hear this from so many of my introverts as well. So many introverts that I speak with, they love being around other people. They love building relationships. They love their social connections. It's not that they don't love that. It's just that they have a different way of being able to recharge, so that when they do have those social interactions and conversations, they feel like they have the energy, they're able to focus and really listen. And that's one of the key, I guess, attributes of an introverted person, is that they tend to be really good listeners. So as far as introverts go, their tendency is going to be to naturally to be quiet first, or to ask questions and to take in a whole lot of information, and then engage in the conversation. So they're not naturally going to be the first people to speak up in a room, or anything like that. They're mostly going to start. And again, I'm making a generalization here, but most of the time they're going to absorb, right? To take in information, try to figure out, okay, what's going on in the room. They're very much in tune with even nonverbal things that are going on, right, in the environment. And so they're going to be taking in all the information, processing it, making sense of it, and then engaging in whatever the situation is. So typically speaking, that's how introverts tend to function. So just because they might be a little bit quieter early on, it doesn't mean that they're not interested or they don't want to be there. It might simply be that they're trying to make sense of what's going on in the environment, so that when they do engage, they feel confident in that, and they feel like they're adding value, or they're building those relationships in a meaningful way. So just something to keep in mind for both extroverts and introverts. If you're an introvert and you're questioning yourself and thinking, okay, why do I not feel as comfortable in these situations? Or maybe why do I hold myself back and not engage as quickly as some other people? That is a superpower. And when you know how to play to those strengths, it just makes it so much easier, and you become more confident in those situations when you know that that's not something that's wrong with you, but you can leverage that to actually engage in deeper, more meaningful conversations, and still make those connections, even though it's going to look different than an introvert might do that, and an extrovert might do that. Also, introverts are really good at relationship building, and just being really like wanting to really dig deep into that relationship and understand people and get to know people. And like I said before, they're really good at active listening. So in one-on-one setting, they tend to really thrive, right? Because they like being able to absorb that information, understand somebody else, and then also be able to engage with that person. So I would also say to introverts, if you are going into a group setting, especially when you don't know anyone, just be intentional about connecting with at least one person and starting to engage in that conversation, because it makes it a lot easier to be in that space and to feel a little bit more comfortable in a one-on-one setting, versus looking at this overwhelming space and being like, okay, where do I even start? And so there's so many things that go into that and playing to their strengths. But I think overall, there's so much that introverts can bring to the table. And from an extroverted standpoint, there's a lot of ways that extroverts can recognize who their introverts are, so that they can help them to be in more engaged in certain situations. Because it's not always the most, those big social settings are not always the most comfortable. It can be a little bit overwhelming.
Well, my natural thought about this is because I know a lot of both, and I have amazing friends that are introverts. So everything you just said is absolutely categorically true. And I think everybody has a unique strength that they bring to any interaction or relationship that they have. And I think that's a responsibility on everybody to understand that. But as a leader, who's been in particularly male dominated fields. And where it's sometimes hard just for even as an extroverted female to bust through the shall we call it the bro club, or just the idea that and sometimes I don't even think it's intentional. I think it's unconscious bias sometimes, right? Because we tend to promote the people that are most like us, and I think that's not just how we look, but also how we behave. So when you think about and we can kind of almost look at it from two different directions. So when you think about it as if I am an introverted person who is interested in leadership and I have all the skills, but I am not the equivalent of a peer. And I have a specific colleague of mine in mind who, I mean, he was that musical, The Greatest Showman on Earth,
oh yes.
He could be the ringmaster. Like he was just so good at selling himself. I mean, he could sell ice to Eskimos. Like he just has this gift. And even as an extrovert, I could never match him. And so I often think about if you naturally are different, what are some things that you, in your experience, would you tell people of how do you set yourself apart? How do you start to make sure that people are seeing you for who you are, that you're not having to become this other thing that's not who you are? Because ultimately, I would assume that doesn't lead to a successful outcome if we try to force ourselves into some box that's not us. But how do you help someone start that path of making sure leadership sees them and understands the value they truly bring?
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what you just said, and I love the way you phrase that. Like understanding who you are, it starts with that, right? Because a lot of times introverts, maybe they don't take the time to really take a step back and understand how they're wired and understand their unique value, understand their strengths, get really aligned with the work that they do and the impact that they do and the connection with why it's so important that they show up in the world and in the workplace in a certain way. So in my coaching practice, what I do is called a leadership zone of genius. So getting clear on what that leadership zone of genius is, because that goes back to what you were saying about knowing who you are. Because from that place, it's a lot easier to start to recognize your strengths, recognize the things that are unique to you and the value that you can offer, so that when you go in to engage in a conversation or when you show up at work, you're playing to your strengths and you're aligned with the things that matter to you, the things that are important. You're making values-based decisions. You're doing all the things that you feel really good about, and it really helps build your confidence, so that when you go to engage in, whether that's a conversation or meeting or whatever it is, you're coming from that place of, okay, I'm going to own my space here. I'm going to own, whatever area that I'm in, but I'm also going to be very acutely aware of not just my surroundings and who's in the room, but also what I bring to the table and my strengths and how I can play to those strengths. One of those strengths is relationship building. So I always tell my introverts, don't just rely on you showing up in that moment, because that can be very overwhelming for an introvert, right? Especially when they're not sure of what's expected, what they're walking into, if they are in a room with people that they don't know. So with introverts, it's very important for them to have as much information ahead of time as possible, so they can even just mentally prepare for whatever is coming. Yeah. So I always tell them it's going to be important for introverts to advocate for themselves. And what I mean by that is ask for what you need, right? As an introvert, if you know what your strengths are, if you can recognize that you are an introvert, then you know that you probably need some time to process through and mentally prepare for whatever's to come. That means if you feel like you need certain information about the environment you're going to be in, who's going to be there, what is your role in that? What is your responsibility when you show up to a certain meeting? What is the expectation of you? Ask all of those questions so that you feel like mentally you can prepare to be able to engage in the conversation when you get them. So that's one of the things I would definitely tell my introverts. The other thing is relationship building is incredibly critical. So one of the things is, and this is also, a lot of this obviously happens before you're actually in that meeting or whatever it is. So knowing your audience and being very intentional about building those relationships ahead of time. Because when you're in a meeting and say, you've got a lot of, and again, I'm generalizing here, but you've got a lot of extroverts in the meeting, and say you feel like, okay, it's very hard for me to interject, or, I'm waiting for my turn to speak and I'm not getting that opportunity. The chances of you not being called upon to provide your opinion when you're in a room full of people that know you well and you build relationships with are pretty slim, right? So if you're there for a purpose, if you're invited to a meeting or invited to some kind of, some kind of group setting, you're there for a reason and a purpose. So know what that is ahead of time. Know what is the purpose of that? What is your objective when you get there? but also know how to, like know the people that you're going to be in that space with. So it makes it a little bit easier. So it's not so overwhelming when you get there about like, oh, okay, I don't know why I'm here. I don't know these people. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Try to get as much clarity ahead of time so that you can prepare. And then for the extroverts, know that your introverts need that. They're going to need that space. And so a lot of times introverts can be a little bit, like they don't necessarily love being put on the spot if they don't have context, if they don't know exactly what's going on. So give them as much of that as possible. Allow the space for them to engage in that conversation. And if from an introverted standpoint, if you feel like you're not getting that, so for example, if you're in an environment and you're like, okay, it's so hard for me to have my voice heard, and I feel like I have so much to give, but I'm not given the opportunity. Don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Don't be afraid to have a conversation with someone, pull somebody to the side, or speak with the people that are responsible for, say, running that meeting or whatever the case may be, and say, okay, so I know this is how it normally goes. I feel like I didn't quite have an opportunity to provide input. And so maybe the next time that we have that meeting, is it possible to maybe change the format a little bit or provide information ahead of time so that I feel more prepared and I can actually be more of service. Also, introverts are really good about like taking and absorbing information, and sometimes they just need extra time to process, not to be afraid to do that after the fact as well. So just because you're in a meeting doesn't mean that everything has to be said in that setting. If you feel like there's something that wasn't said or you didn't have an opportunity, connect with that person or the people afterwards and say, I didn't have a chance to, to get to this, but there's something that I want to share, or I have a question that I think might be helpful. So there's other ways to go about still playing to those strengths without feeling the need to constantly like push yourself to interject and things like that. So there's so many different things to think about, but those are just some of the things off the top of my head that I think are really helpful to consider.
Well, I think that's good advice for anybody in any circumstance, because I feel like we're and I don't know if this is just necessarily since the pandemic, or I think it even existed before, but there's always so much pressure to perform. I think when you get into these environments, that I think that's great advice for anybody, is that you don't feel like you have to have answers or responses if you actually don't have the right answer or response in that moment, because that could actually dig you a hole you can't get out of. So I think that's actually really great information just in general. The other things I was thinking of just throughout my career that I have found helpful, and one of the things I use a lot with people that I work with, is practicing. So like if you know you're going to go into a conversation that you're not feeling particularly comfortable in, and this can apply for anybody, because I feel like sometimes as an extrovert, you think you can wing it. Like you think you can just kind of go in and do it, because you're kind of confident. And I always caution people, if it's a really important conversation, so a little bit different than the meeting you just described, but something where something like it doesn't even have to be contentious. It's just an important conversation that needs to happen, is the importance of practicing it. And like, I would always say, I do this a lot in my coaching, is like, all right, what's your first line? How are you starting the conversation? And so forcing them to not just think about like the outcome of the conversation, but exactly like, what are the words you're going to say? Can I tell you what I heard? Is that what you intended? And then so you give people the chance to actually practice a little bit. And so the nerves settle down. You're not walking and winging it. You've kind of, you've said it a couple of different ways so you can get a sense of maybe the right word choice, so that you say it the way you intend, versus kind of just blurting something out because it's not planned very well. So I found that is incredibly helpful to practice. The other thing that I've thought of, which I think some companies are really good at this, some aren't, but I always encourage people to do this in general, is to always find what I would call peer mentors. So people you can partner with if they have a skill set that's stronger than yours. I've seen it happen with people with PowerPoint presentations. They're just better at visualizations and like, hey, here's what I created. Can you give me some feedback on this? But just my thought is, even in this moment, like when you're talking about somebody who is so fundamentally different, particularly if you're in a larger group, because I mean, our teams are so multi-matrix now, and would you advocate on like getting almost like a peer mentor of somebody who is not like you?
Oh, 100%. And I love that you just touched on so many elements of this, because this is another really important aspect, and that's your support system, right? So many people can make up that support system. I love that you brought up that example of the peer mentor, because I think that's a really great example. there's sponsors as well, right? So leaning on your leadership, because that's why they're there to support you. But then there's also sponsors within the organization that can advocate for you when you're not in the room, right? So like really building on those key relationships is going to be really important. Of course, I always advocate for some kind of coach or mentor or somebody in that capacity, so that to your example, I mean, that was such a beautiful example of this, to kind of bounce ideas off each other, right? To practice the conversation ahead of time, to talk it out so that it becomes more natural when you're actually in that situation, especially if it is like a really important conversation that you're having.
Yeah.
So I'm a huge advocate for that complete support system. It could be friends, family, mentors, sponsors, your leadership, and having a really strong relationships with people in your leadership line at work. And different things like that, having a coach to support you, whoever it is, but having that really strong network and support system is incredibly critical, whether you're an introvert or extrovert. I mean, but at the same time, especially with introverts, because it helps to practice, it helps to feel a little bit more like to know that you have that preparation done ahead of time, not just with not just by yourself, but also leaning on other people to be able to help you to navigate that. So I love that you brought that up.
Well, and I like that you mentioned the idea of a sponsor, or particularly if you're, and so part of me leans more to like, yes, coaches, obviously great, but I also advocate getting that mentor, that internal mentor. Yeah. Because I would imagine if you are an introvert, it is a harder path for you to promotion and leadership. It potentially could be, right, if people are not understanding the value you bring. So if you're still in that place of struggling to articulate it, get it out in the right way, having that internal support system of either that sponsor, that mentor, whatever, who can advocate for you in those right moments the moments you're not in the room.
Right.
I think could be absolutely critical to helping somebody be seen. I mean, just that basically just be seen. Because, because I was thinking about this, I was talking about it almost from the flip of it, like as a leader, and I've had I can think about like the diversity of personalities that I've led over my career. And I think of one particular gentleman. And I think it's important to mention he was a gentleman, was not because I want to get into the gender differences too, because I'm intrigued if there's some trends or insights you have from a gender difference before we go there. But he was a young man and very smart. We called him the sniper because he didn't say much, said very little, incredibly quiet, did his job, did it all. Everything was always on time. And when he did say something, it was usually incredibly smart, incredibly witty, and very insightful. Yeah. But he rarely said anything. And so that's why we nicknamed him the sniper for that reason, because it was like one shot and he's good. Like he doesn't have to fill space. And so, but I think about when I had to advocate, I was trying to advocate for him to get a higher role. And the challenge is leadership above me did not see him the same way they saw others. And so those kind of things. So, and so I feel very lucky that I saw the potential he had just because I was so close with my team. But when I think about it from the aspect of that individual contributor wanting to promote in, would you change anything about the advice? Would you add something to the advice of for those people who it's just harder and how, for maybe not even that person, from a leadership perspective, what would you tell leaders who are leading introverted individuals? Maybe that's so the angle we should look at this.
Yes, because there's so many different aspects of what you just said that I want to definitely touch on. So from a leadership perspective, first of all, have those conversations, especially with the people that are more introverted. They're going to be much more likely to open up in a one-on-one setting. So as a leader, being really keenly aware of, first of all, you've got to know what questions to ask, right? How to draw that out of your introverts, so that you are very keenly aware of not just who they are and what they bring to the table, but how they see themselves and what it is that they want. Because not every introvert wants to, even though yes, they might be ambitious, but not all of them want to be leaders, right? They don't always want to be in those kinds of positions. So it's great that a leader wants to advocate and wants to help their team members, But at the same time, it's going to be really important for you to know those team members really, really well, know what is important to them, their strengths, what it is that they want out of their career, so that you can advocate in the right way, not just the potential that you see in them, but actually, do they want that, right? Do they want to take that next step? Because
do you want more for them than they want for themselves? That's a whole nother episode.
Yes, exactly. Because in that case, and I love that you brought up the sniper. I'm going to just use that term because you used it and I love it. But in that situation, does that person really want to? I don't know if it was a leadership position or whatever that is as a next step. Do they want that level of visibility, exposure, and what is the expectation of them at that level? So they need to be clear, right? So that introvert needs to be clear on, is that something that they want to consider? And then also, what is the expectation? Because if the expectation is different than what they're comfortable with or what they want, that might not be the right fit. There might be other ways to go about giving them that growth that they want. But maybe it looks different, right, for that introvert. So it just depends on what they're looking for and what that might look like, what's the right fit. So as a leader, it's going to be really important for that leader to know their people very, very well, know their direct reports, know what's going to be right. And also, of course, from a leadership perspective, to be able to pick out things in those, in your individual contributors or in your leaders that maybe they don't even see it about, in themselves, but taking the time to get out of the weeds and to have those conversations is going to be so incredibly important, because you need to know what they are invested in and what is of interest to them. Because otherwise, if they're not invested in it, they're not going to really put everything they've got into getting to that next position and really excelling there. So I think I would say that's probably the biggest thing, is just align really well with what they believe is important for them and where they want to go in their career and why. Really get to the bottom of why is it, what is it that they want next and why is that important? Because I think that gets to the core of like how leaders can be really effective in helping and advocating for their team.
Yeah, I guess I think I'm fully aware of some leaders that there have been misalignments. Like they saw more in their teams than what that person wanted. I think in this particular case, he was interested because I think he wanted to see if it was possible for him. Because he was so good. He was good on a one-on-one mentoring team members. And it wasn't until after he was no longer my employee, he did move into a leadership position. And I think he did okay. But it's that kind of thing. Like sometimes they don't know. You don't know until you actually get into it. And then suddenly, not this gentleman, but a completely different person, I will never forget, was like, if I had known this is what leadership was, I'd have never done it. But in like most things, sometimes you have to try it to know if that's the right thing for you. But yeah, no, I like that a great deal, because again, I think it's kind of from two ways. Like it's the ultimate dance or conversation between a leader and their employee of what do they need? Do you really know them? Because I think that's a challenge. Especially when you have teams where you have so many people. But ultimately, that's the determining factor of how you can best advocate for those you serve.
Exactly. And a really critical component to those conversations is psychological safety. So being able to create a safe environment to have those conversations, so that when you're having the conversation, they feel like they are safe to express to you even their concerns about maybe getting to that next level. What are they hesitant about? Things like that. So creating that environment where they're not going to hesitate to share some of those things with you is going to help the leader to figure out how to best navigate that as well. Yeah.
That's so good. So I want to hit one last question before we close out. So, well, maybe two. So I did ask, because I was interested in this, is in your research, in the work that you've done, have you seen significant disparities between female introverts and male introverts, and how that just plays out in the corporate environment?
Oh, I love this question. Because interestingly, I had a very different opinion about what I was going to find at the beginning of this journey. So when I decided, okay, I want to work with introverts, in my mind, because I'm a female, I thought I'm going to attract a lot of female introverts, and it's probably going to be more of a female thing, right? Than a male.
I would think that.
Yes,
but I'm hensing there's a big but.
That is absolutely not the case. So I've coached like well over 1,000 people at this point, and I'll just take it from my sample size of people that I've coached. But in terms of that experience, almost every single male introvert that I've spoken with, and female introvert, comes through with exactly the same struggles, exactly the same thing. And it's so fascinating to me that even when they describe their experience as an introvert in the corporate world, it's very similar. The challenges that they have are very similar, and it's not gender based. So I don't have a male coming, a male introvert coming to me and saying, "Oh, I have males that are very extroverted, and so I'm struggling to engage with them." They're, obviously introverted and extroverted males and females in the workplace, and each one, there's going to be pros and cons, right? Like there's going to be different dynamics that go on there. So I haven't really seen a major distinction between how introverted men show up in the workplace versus introverted women. If anything, what I've seen over these 10 plus years is so many similarities, and that blew my mind because I was not expecting that. I was like, surely from a male perspective, they're probably experiencing this a little bit differently. Now, of course, as male and female, we're wired a little bit differently, just generally speaking. But when it comes to that introversion perspective, it's actually very similar what they experience in the workplace and the challenges that they need to overcome. And actually, I'll tell you, I'll give you an example of a conversation I had just today with one of my introverted leaders. And so one of the things that he was talking about, his company is going through a major reorg. And so his boss's boss was let go, and now they have new leadership coming in at that senior leadership level. And his manager is probably getting ready to leave his role. And one of the things he told me is like, you know what, Sharissa, I built such great relationships with them. They were my biggest advocates, but now going into the new year, I feel like I have to start from scratch. Like I haven't really, like there's no one really else in the organization that I can go to continue advocating for me and for my career. And so that's why those relationships are so important as well, right? So you don't want to rely on just one or two people. But my point is that he's really good at that one-on-one connection. And so it's a little bit more challenging for him to like branch out and connect with a lot of different people. But we worked on a strategy and we're currently working on a strategy together about how he doesn't have to, find himself in that situation going forward if he's really intentional and strategic about how to create those really, strong professional relationships. But I hear that from both males and females, right? So I have a couple of people that I'm really close with and I know would advocate for me, but I'm not the type of person that's just going to go out and, not a whole lot of people are probably going to know me. They know my work. But at the same time, it's challenging to kind of get ahead because not many people know me. And there's a lot of ways that we can do this as introverts that actually play really well to our strengths. One of them is that relationship building aspect. But generally speaking, I hear this on both sides. These are very common, like challenges that both men and women introverts face.
Do you see any differences in industry?
Well, I will say, coming from a tech background, which is obviously very male dominated and still is, based on like, I left that when it was a little over 10 years ago. And even though there's been, a little bit more of a shift, but it's still, pretty much male dominated. And I tend to coach for a lot of tech companies as well.
Yeah.
And so in the tech space, there's a little bit of a different dynamic, not only because of the different people that technology tends to attract and personalities and all of that. There are obviously a lot of introverts in the tech space, but also there's a balance between the two. But the tech space tends to be very fast paced. Decisions need to be made quickly. The things are evolving and changing all the time. And so it can be really challenging, especially for an introvert, to navigate in that space. But generally speaking, in terms of introversion and extroversion, it's pretty standard across the board. The only difference is with the tech space is that there's some of those other dynamics at play when it comes to the work environment, and different companies are obviously very different. Some companies do really well with how they set up that environment and policies and different things like that to support people with different preferences and personalities and things like that.
Oh, this has been fascinating. I have loved every second of this conversation. And I want to be respectful of your time since you've been so great in giving us some of your time today. But before we go, is there one last piece of advice, insight that you want to leave with our listeners about this topic that you're incredibly passionate about? Just one thing you'd want them to take away.
Yes, I'm so glad that you asked me this, because one thing that we haven't touched on yet that I think is also really important for introverts is aligning with meaningful work. And I get this question so much about like my own experience and my own speaking and these podcasts that I do and things like that. A lot of people will look at me and go, but you don't seem like you're an introvert. Like, how is that? And I always tell them, like, for introverts, be really intentional about aligning with work that you feel is impactful, like being really passionate about and invested in the work that you're doing. Because when there's alignment there, it's so much easier to get into that zone of genius that I spoke about earlier, right? So align your strengths with the things that really interest you, with the way in which you can be really engaged in the type of work that you're doing. It's very easy to show up, or much easier to show up in that space of confidence when you feel like what you do matters and you have a place and you're doing work that really matters. And that's where my passion comes from. So all of this energy that you see, it's because I feel like I finally align with that meaningful work to me, and I feel like I can really help and make a difference. So that's what I would, not just introverts, that goes for extroverts as well, but and get the help that you need, if it's a coach, mentor, whoever it is, to help you to do that, to help you to align with the work that you're doing. Because the more you can get in alignment there, the easier, all of these other things become.
I think that's brilliant. And I think I applaud that answer, just because I think in general, the closer you can get to doing work that speaks to you at some deeper level. I like to tell people I'm not a paper pusher. Like anything that I do, I have to feel like there's a deeper value and a deeper meaning. And in some way, shape, or form, I'm using a strength that I've been naturally given to help try to make this world a slightly better place. So I love that so much. Thank you so very much for joining me today. And we might try to get you back on. There's so much exciting stuff this year. So we'd love to have you on if that works with your schedule. And you can share some more insights and help bring balance to how shockingly, you brought balance, but also so much of it sounds very, very familiar, which I love completely.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the incredible work that you are doing, Kimberly. So I just want to definitely honor you for that, because it's not easy doing this work and like just pouring into other people and just wanting to make a difference and having an impact. So I want to thank you for all the time and effort and energy that I know goes into what you do. So thank you so much. And I would absolutely love to be back whenever you'll have me. So thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.